This isn't going to be easy. You're about to be introduced to two victims of war. Adam Samer al-Ghul, shot dead, aged 8. Basil Abulwaf, shot dead, aged 15. In a city under lockdown, under the gunpoint of Israeli soldiers, where hospitals have been blockaded and civilians subjected to all sorts of hardships, humiliations, and heartbreak. It sounds like Gaza, right? Well, it isn't. This is Jenin in the occupied West Bank. The Palestinian Authority is supposed to be in charge here. The PA is dominated by Fatah, but it's considered to have little real power. Hopes had been high the West Bank might one day form part of a sovereign Palestinian state. But the reality is very, very different. I'm Dareen Abu Gaida. This is Pinch Point, where geography and politics collide. It's been called the War on Gaza, but the fact is, all the occupied territories are at war in one way or another. In Gaza, nearly 2 million people have been forced from their homes. But it's bad in the West Bank too. The United Nations says thousands of people are going through some of the same horrible things. They're subjected to violence not just from Israeli forces, but also from the Israeli settlers who've illegally set up their homes there. It's all being called a clear violation of Israel's obligations under international and human rights law. But it could have all been very, very different. In the 1990s, Yasser Arafat, the leader of the Palestinian Liberation Organization at the time, met the Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. Back then, there was open talk of a Palestinian state to be set up in Gaza and the West Bank. Both had been occupied by Israel during the 1967 Arab-Israeli War. The process agreed to by Arafat and Rabin was designed to achieve a lasting peace, part of the Oslo Accords. It's known as the two-state solution. So like I said, the Palestinians would get Gaza and the West Bank, while Israel and Palestine would share Jerusalem as their capitals. But Rabin was assassinated in 1995, and this man, Benjamin Netanyahu, became prime minister a year later. The Oslo process slowed way down. Hope drained away. Just before the Gaza war started last October, the polling company Gallup asked Palestinians what they thought. This is what they had to say. In just over 10 years, support for the two-state solution had dropped by half. And it's mostly younger Palestinians who can't see two states existing side by side. Given that the majority of the population is under 30, this two-state option isn't looking so good. And remember, this is how people were feeling before the war on Gaza even started. But for the international community, the two-state solution is the only option on the table.
We must be united in demanding an end to the occupation and the blockade of Gaza. It is long past time to move in a determined, irreversible way towards a two-state solution on the basis of United Nations resolutions and international law, with Israel and Palestine living side by side in peace and security, with Jerusalem as the capital of both states.
But a fully sovereign Palestine? These days, where do you even start? Yes, Palestine has been accepted as an observer state at the United Nations General Assembly, but any suggestion that Palestinians enjoy freedom of movement or self-determination, well, it's not even close to anything like that. Today, there are a number of roadblocks to establishing a Palestinian state, but here's one of the big ones: Israeli settlements. They're all over the occupied West Bank and have sprung up to the point where Palestinians living there find it very difficult to move around. There are walls and checkpoints everywhere. Many of the settlements were built under Netanyahu's watch. Remember, this is the man who recently told Israel that only he can prevent a Palestinian state from happening. There's one fundamental truth we can't forget in all of this, and it's that all Israeli settlements are considered illegal under international law. Still, Israel has built roads where it doesn't have the jurisdiction to build, and some of these roads are exclusive to settlers, like Route 4370. It connects the Jiva Binyamin settlement in the Israeli-occupied West Bank to Jerusalem. One side is restricted to only Israeli vehicles. It has a high wall in the middle. Critics call it the apartheid highway. As many as 700,000 Israeli settlers now live on Palestinian land illegally. That's about 10% of Israel's population. And don't the Palestinians know it? across the occupied West Bank between 2010 and 2019, there were nearly 3,000 Israeli settler attacks. At least 20 Palestinians were killed and more than 1,200 were injured. Last year, even before the current war, the violence was actually getting worse. In February 2023, at least 400 settlers attacked villages around Nablus. One man died, more than 30 homes were burned down, hundreds of cars were destroyed. Palestinians were beaten with metal rods and hit with rocks. And last June, settlers burned down a Palestinian farmer's barn. The Israeli military has the power to shut down neighborhoods, cities, the entire occupied territories at a moment's notice, conducting violent raids and destroying homes as they see fit. And since the war started on October 7th, the UN says daily settler attacks have more than doubled. France calls it a policy of terror. In February, the US imposed sanctions on several Israeli settlers over violence in the occupied West Bank. And since the war in Gaza began, well, more than 1,000 Palestinians in the West Bank have been displaced. In this environment, a two-state solution hardly seems even remotely possible. The growing crisis in the region led this man, Craig Mokhiber, a senior UN human rights official, to tell his bosses he was leaving his job early. He says the two-state mantra has become an open joke within the corridors of the United Nations.
Nobody who follows these circumstances, either from the political side or from the human rights side, believe, one, that a two-state solution is possible anymore. There's nothing left for a Palestinian state that would be sustainable or just or possible in any respect, and everyone knows that. And secondly, that solution never dealt with the problem of the fundamental human rights of Palestinians.
So, if the two-state solution isn't, well, a solution, what's the answer? What's the best long-term solution for both Israelis and Palestinians? There's a debate for another option, the one-state solution. Suggestions for that have included a state with federal districts, autonomous regions, and even equal rights for everyone, regardless of ethnicity or religion. None has so far gained much support. And complicating any solution, be it one state or two states, is what happens to the refugees, the Palestinians who were forced from their homes by Zionists during the Nekada. When the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees began its work in 1950, there were about 750,000 Palestinians who had lost their homes and any way of making a living. Now, adding in their descendants, about 5.9 million Palestinian refugees are eligible for UNRWA services. More than 1.5 million of those live in 58 recognized Palestinian refugee camps in Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, the Gaza Strip, and the West Bank, including occupied East Jerusalem. One man fighting to get his home back is Hussam Zumlot, the head of the Palestinian mission to the UK. For him, the future of a Palestinian state and the future of the refugees are one and the same thing.
I don't like the term two-state solution because it assumes that there are no states and we have to create two states. There is already one state, and that state is occupying the other area. I'd like to say we must end the occupation, end Israel's occupation, establish a state of Palestine on the 1967 borders with Jerusalem as our capital, and implement the right of return for our refugees. This is a sacred right because it is our homes. I'm one of them. That as much as there is collective claim to our homes, there is a private claim. This is private property.
But in the meantime, the violence goes on. And more than that, it keeps getting worse. The humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza, described by the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, is spreading to the occupied West Bank. The prospect of creating a Palestinian state looks ever more distant. The number of Palestinians facing harassment and homelessness is going up. So too are the number of casualties. And that means more boys like Adam and Bassem will continue to die.